Please welcome to the stage Ohio's Electric Cooperative's Executive Director of Information Technology, Mr. Greg Niese, and Cyber Risk Assessment Program Manager, Mr. Eric Fox.
I'm going to start us out by explaining why cybersecurity is important as ever, both for us as electric co-ops and for our industry in general. We'll look at some trends and a few cyber attacks from the last couple of years, and then I'll turn it over to Eric, who will get into how our co-ops are facing these challenges and staying secure, and how we at statewide are supporting those co-op efforts. First, let's take a look at how system vulnerabilities have changed in the last 25 years. There's a government-funded project that tracks known hardware and software vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities cover everything from Microsoft, Apple, and Google products, all the way to the companies that make the controls in your substations and the software systems that operate the grid. As you can see, the number of published vulnerabilities has increased dramatically over the last 10 years, reaching a total of nearly 50,000 last year, and that number is expected to exceed 60,000 this year, and that trend's not slowing down. And these vulnerabilities are important because they represent potential open doors and windows into our networks and systems, which help give attackers an opportunity to get in and do their damage. So it's important that we stay ahead of patching these to keep those windows and doors closed to attacks. And as you may guess, just the sheer volume of these vulnerabilities is making this more challenging every year. Now, I'll admit, your co-op does not have to patch 50,000 or 60,000 vulnerabilities every year, but as we have more and more software and hardware systems that are being produced, that are controlled digitally, electronically by computers, this number is going up. It's an increasing pie, and we're just taking a bigger slice of that pie every year. Similarly, we see a trend with disclosed data breaches in the U.S. over the last 20 years. I want to point out that most of the organizations here were likely investing more and more resources into cybersecurity every year. Certainly none of them wanted to be on part of these statistics, but the attacks, again, have continued to rise, and there's no sign of that slowing down. At this point, I'd like to just give you a high-level view, 10,000-foot view, if you will, of the history of cyber attacks. Up through the early 1990s, from the dawn of computers and the internet and the networks, hacking was often a hobby of cyber enthusiasts. They did it because it was fun. They wanted to learn how technology worked, including how to do things that they probably should not do at times. Some liked the notoriety among their peers when they did something daring or newsworthy, and there were some definitely that had malicious intentions. But by the late 1990s and early 2000s, that shifted dramatically from hacking to attacking, especially as cybercriminal gangs began to grow. Online stores became more common, and with early e-commerce, we saw stolen credit cards, personal information. We began to see those large data breaches that first affected thousands, and eventually we started seeing millions of people being affected, and we started hearing about identity theft and the need to protect personal information. But by around 2010 and up till now, the landscape has shifted again, with nation states, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, being more prominent cyber threats. Criminal gangs are still very active, especially with ransomware, but many of those gangs are now affiliated with those nation states. Low-level individual criminals are also still active, but they rely on ransomware as a service or other tools that are often created and sold by these criminal gangs on the dark web. This evolution from individuals in their basement 30, 40 years ago to criminals and gangs and now to nation states have seen these attacks and these attackers leverage more human expertise, more financial resources, and more powerful tools. So these attacks are becoming more complex every year, and that makes them harder to defend against. And that also explains why, even though this trend keeps going up, while all these firms, these companies, these organizations are spending money to stop it. One of the first publicized remote cyber attacks on the electric grid occurred in Ukraine in 2015. The first similar attack occurred here in the U.S. about 4 years later. That was against S-Power, a renewable energy company in Utah. S-Power was hit with what was known as a denial of service attack, which caused intermittent communications disruptions over a 12-hour period across about a dozen of their generation sites. There were no blackouts, no broader compromise, but the incident did highlight the potential risk of using increasingly computerized systems to operate the grid and the need to properly secure those systems. I'm sure some of you have probably heard of Delta Montrose Electric Association, one of the first major cyber attacks publicized against an electric co-op. 34,000 members out of Montrose, Colorado. Just after 5 a.m. on Sunday, November 7th, 2021, DMEA's IT manager received a call telling him that the co-op's dispatchers have been locked out of all the co-op's office systems. The operations side was not attacked, but the business side was hit hard. Member data, meter data management, the mapping system, file servers, the phone system, email system, they were all down. DMEA did have backups off-site, data backups, in another location miles away. Unfortunately, those backups were online and accessible to the attackers, so the attackers destroyed those as well. Fortunately, DMEA had been in the middle of a member information system upgrade. As part of that process, they'd provided a copy of their member data to their system vendor, an ISC. That copy of data saved them from having to recreate all their member data from scratch. Now imagine if your co-op did not have access to their member account information, no names, no addresses, no phone numbers, no meter information. How hard would that be to recreate all that? How much time would it take? What would the expense be? How would you even get the bills out? The MEA survived, but for many months it was an uphill climb. Their billing system was restored within 2 months after the attack, thanks to that accidental backup of data they had given to NISC. But they had to rely on manual processes for many months longer for a lot of other business systems that needed to be recreated from scratch. And years of important company data and information were lost forever. Now, all this happened because of a single unpatched email server that the attackers were able to compromise. So that was just one open window in their cyber defenses. And DMEA is not alone. Critical infrastructure in general continues to be a target. Edisto Electric Cooperative in South Carolina was attacked in September of 2024, just 24 hours before Hurricane Helene hit the co-op's physical infrastructure. The co-op did not suffer a total data loss or exposure of personal information, but the attack left them without desktops and maps, just as they were preparing for hurricane recovery. The timing of this attack was probably not a coincidence. Attackers sometimes will wait until a storm or similar event stresses an intended target before launching their cyber attacks. The attackers know that by kicking you when you're down at a time when you may be more desperate, it's much easier to possibly extract a ransomware payment if that's what they're after, and that is what these attackers were after. In October 2025, 2 Texas-based co-ops were attacked by a Russian ransomware group, and large amounts of data were stolen. 2026, 2 more co-ops were targeted by ransomware groups. And this isn't just a co-op issue or an electric sector issue. As Tim Gallagher mentioned earlier, you may have seen those news stories recently about the coordinated attacks on water systems across multiple states, which appear to be nation-state related attacks. Most of these breaches appear to be against systems that weren't properly segmented from non-operational networks, with some possibly directly connected to the internet, which if you're in IT, you know that's a very bad thing. And in January 2024, several large investor-owned utilities had confidential grid-related information exposed when a trusted vendor was compromised. And this last one is another example of a supply chain attack, which is becoming more prominent as a risk and needs to be understood and mitigated. So speaking of supply chain attacks, I want to look at one that occurred about 6 years ago. You may not have heard much about this in the news, but the cybersecurity field knows this. SolarWinds is This compromise is considered one of the cautionary tales of supply chain risk. SolarWinds is a company that sells tools used by large organizations to monitor enterprise network systems. In 2020, its flagship product, called Orion, was used by more than 30,000 companies and organizations, including most of the Fortune 500 companies and large government entities. From late 2019 through 2020, Russian nation-state attackers compromised the SolarWinds Orion software system and inserted malicious backdoor code. That backdoor was then used to gain entry into some customer networks. About 18,000 SolarWinds customers were believed to have been received that malicious code, but after analysis, only about 100 customers were later confirmed to have been actively compromised. But those compromised customers were a who's who of major technology, telecom, finance, national defense companies, as well as 9 major federal agencies. This attack was focused on espionage and intelligence gathering, so there was no immediate visible damage. There was no ransomware, no obvious system disruptions. It was carefully and patiently executed, and it went undetected for many months in all these organizations. And something to think about is that in 2020, this type of attack would have been difficult to scale up to thousands or tens of thousands of customers or target organizations because it required significant hands-on human expertise. But artificial intelligence may change that in the future. Attackers can potentially use AI, weaponized to scale up sophisticated attacks like this to include many more targets. And this is a concern to me because we are a SolarWinds customer. So we were fortunate. We were not one of the 100. We were not one of the 18,000 that received the malicious code. But it's very sobering to see this kind of thing play out and know that you were close to dodging that bullet. Another type of attack that's concerning is a zero-click attack. A zero-click attack can compromise a device without requiring the user to do anything. The person does not need to click a link, open a file, type a password into a fake website. These attacks take advantage of vulnerabilities in software tools such as messaging apps, email apps, call handling systems, or file previews, which can automatically process incoming information. With these attacks, simply receiving a malicious message, call, or file attachment can allow malware to run. Now, this may seem scarier than most malware, but in reality, it's not much different than the attack on DMEA, right? Because in that case also, the attackers did not need a human being's assistance to compromise their systems. But it does show how much worse some of this is going to be over time. So how can we protect our cooperatives? First and foremost, it's important to create a culture of cyber safety before your co-op is attacked. As cooperative employees, we've always been strong when it comes to physical safety. We understand the importance of safety briefings, procedures, equipment, and looking out for one another. But cyber safety can feel different. Many people are less comfortable with technology, and it is easy to think of cybersecurity as something that the IT department handles for us. Unfortunately, in today's threat environment, that mindset is not enough. We need all hands on deck to keep our co-op secure. We need to cover the basics. There are many things that go into good cybersecurity. Some of the keys are security awareness training, which helps employees recognize suspicious activity and how to respond to it. Multi-factor authentication, which makes it harder for attackers to use stolen passwords. Patching vulnerabilities closes known openings before attackers can use them. Good offline backups are critical, and those backups need to be tested. Disaster recovery and incident response plans are also critical, and those plans need to be practiced before an attack occurs. Logging and monitoring help identify suspicious activity before it becomes a full compromise. And supply chain risk has to be managed because our trusted vendors and partners can become an indirect path into our systems. We have to ask ourselves, what are we missing? One important lesson taken from Delta Montrose is they had planned for physical disaster. Their offices were near an airport, so they were thinking about a plane crash or another event that could affect their building. They were backing up the right data, they had their backups offsite, and they tested their backups to make sure they worked. But the missing question, as DMEA found out, was whether the backups themselves were safe from cyber attack. We need to invest in people, process, and technology. We need to ensure we're training all of our employees and engaging them to create that culture of cyber safety. We need to train our technical staff, ensure they have the tools they need to cover all those basics that I just mentioned. We need to have repeatable, sustainable processes to ensure we're not missing any of those open doors or windows. And we need to keep improving because whatever worked last year may not be enough to defend against what the attackers do next. And for those with governance responsibility, you don't need to fully understand all this to help your co-op be secure. Ask questions. How is your co-op handling all these basics? How are we building that cybersecurity culture? Are we protecting our operational systems? So how are we at the statewide supporting our members? We're doing this primarily through our Rural Electric Cyber Advancement Program, or RECAP. So what is RECAP? Our program began in late 2021 when we began performing cybersecurity assessments for each of our co-ops. These cyber assessments were built around a tool that we had acquired through NRECA in 2020, which was a 133-question survey of the co-op's cybersecurity practices and capabilities. The assessments were scheduled on a 2-year cycle for each co-op, and the assessments were led by a facilitator from statewide with participation from subject matter experts from both the statewide and other member co-ops. This cyber assessment process was designed to help the co-op identify where they are with respect to covering all those cybersecurity basics. And it covers both the business systems and the operational systems at a high level. As an output from this process, we provide the co-op a prioritized list of findings that the co-op can then use as guidance for cyber improvement plans between those 2-year assessment visits. This process also helps managers get more visibility into the status of the co-op's posture with respect to those cybersecurity basics and whether that's continuing in the right direction. The initial steps of the RECAP program proved successful, so the program was expanded in 2024. That expansion included adding dedicated staff to support the program. Eric here, who joined the program as the program manager in late 2024. And it also included plans to develop more cybersecurity services for our co-ops, including training, cybersecurity exercises, and policy development. So in addition to further strengthening how we cover the basics, these new RECAP cyber services were designed to focus on building up that cybersecurity culture and push us to ask what are we missing in our cyber defenses and where we need to improve. Last thing I want to leave you with before I turn it over to Eric is a high-level view of the overall growth of our RECAP programs, especially since that program expansion in 2024. What began as a single cyber assessment visit with each co-op every 2 years through 2024 has been rapidly expanding to multiple annual visits since then. And this is where we're seeing those new service visits to your co-ops begin to show up and have an impact. So now I'll turn it over to Eric, who will go into more detail about the RECAP program and also a little more information about current and potential future threats.
Thank you. All righty. There's supposed to be a title page there. So yeah, as Greg was talking through, we started the RECAP program and doing assessments back in 2020. And over the course of the next few years, got around to each of the Ohio co-ops and subsequently moved into a second round of that, going through and retesting everyone who'd gone through that assessment before. And here you can see kind of the results of all of the different co-ops, with the blue bars being round one, the green bars being round two. And I was very gratified to see that while the amount of improvement varied, every single co-op going through round two has done better than they did in round one. And particularly some of the folks that were a little further behind at the beginning have made great strides. And so we're starting to see the overall cybersecurity position of Ohio's co-ops start to level out, and everybody's at a much higher baseline than they were. The question we had is, where do we go from there? Because that top line there is a perfect score on the RC3 assessment standard that we're using, and so you can see there's not a lot of headroom there to continue improving for a lot of these co-ops. And it's not like the cybersecurity industry has stayed still since then. In fact, although we started using this platform, the RC3 assessment in 2021, the underlying assessment format that it was based on, an assessment called the C2M2 that the Department of Energy puts out, that base assessment came out in 2017. So we're now almost a decade past that, and obviously there's been a lot of changes in the industry since then. And in fact, the C2M2 that the assessment standard we use is based on, that has been updated since then, and the RC3 assessment itself has not. So that left us in kind of a situation where we're thinking like, well, where do we go from here? When we went from round 1 to round 2, we wanted to add some sort of different value to look at something different than we had previously. And so what we introduced there was an OSINT report, open source intelligence. And that's basically, what could an attacker figure out about your co-op that would be useful to stage an attack without actually hacking anything? If they go on your website, what information can they find out about who the employees are, and what email addresses they might target? If they go out into public breach exposure reports, are there employees who have had credentials compromised from their Facebook account or from their Amazon account, things that maybe there could be shared password use between, so all of these different things that are out there in the world that can be leveraged to make attacks more effective. So for round 2, we're going through and doing that for each of the co-ops, but we don't just want to do another round of that for round 3, because that doesn't change that much from year to year. Mostly we want to give you a sense of what is out there so that we can be appropriately cautious about what we put out into the world. But for round 3, what we really felt was needed was an update to this underlying assessment. And the NRECA was not producing an updated version of this, so we went ahead and did that ourselves and have added a number of new questions to that for round 3. In addition to that, we've changed the documentation standard there a little bit, where rather than just asking, hey, do you have this policy, do you have this emergency response plan, we'll sit down and take a look at each of those documents as we do the assessment and make sure that all the documentation that you think you have is indeed in order, so that you can depend on that should an emergency happen and you actually have to pull out that incident response plan or whatever, and you don't find out that it's 5 years old and a lot of the information in there's no longer relevant and you're scrambling. We want you to be as ready ahead of incidents as possible. So in terms of the things that we're looking at, this is the full list, probably in too small a font for you to read, but we're talking about asset inventories, other risk assessments that you've had done by third parties. What are some of your IT processes? How do you review your logs? What are your cybersecurity policies? Things like that. And we just make sure that all of those things are in order and up to date. And then in terms of categories that we've been adding to the RC3 framework, there are kind of 5 main silos that we've added questions surrounding. One is what's known as shadow IT. It's basically all of the IT devices on your network that your IT department didn't put there. So if an employee decided they really like this printer from home and they went and plugged it into their computer, that would be an example of shadow IT. But it can also take a more malicious form, where maybe someone comes into your lobby and plugs something into the network jack that's there, and it gets on the network. And if it looks like something that's supposed to be there, maybe it looks like a Glade plug-in or something, it could sit there, potentially for weeks or months, and if it's not anybody's job to be checking on that, then that could be posing a threat to your network. So, do you have IT systems in place that are going to detect those sorts of things when they're on the network? Because it's one thing to have an inventory, it's another thing to notice a change in a list hundreds of items long. Another area is OT monitoring. So basically anything that is grid related, do we have good systems in place to detect any sort of cyber attack or suspicious behavior going on there? And this has traditionally been challenging because on the IT side of the fence, what we're used to doing is just aggressively scanning things, seeing if there's any vulnerabilities on the network. And if something breaks as a result of scanning, well, that's that device's fault for being weak. And we should, fix that in the future, so it's not a problem. It doesn't work as well when you're scanning things that are connected to the grid, because obviously if the power goes out, that was a bad security measure, because the whole point of the security measures are to keep the grid from going out in the first place. So there are systems that are built specifically designed around scanning these more fragile systems, some of them older systems, because obviously if we've purchased some big piece of grid connected technology and it's 20 years old, but it's got decades of life left in it, we don't necessarily want to throw that in the trash and buy a new one just because it doesn't support the latest security standards. We want to find ways to protect that and continue using it so that we aren't being wasteful with our money. So there are systems available now to scan devices like that in a way that's going to be gentle and make sure that it can figure out what's going on there without actually breaking things. So we've been taking a little more look at onboarding some of those different tools. Also, cloud configuration is so much more of an issue than it was 9 years ago. At that point, if someone was talking about the cloud, they were probably talking about their own servers in some sort of data center and just backing up stuff there. Maybe they had server space rented in the Amazon cloud, things like that. But at this point, we have all sorts of cooperative data and infrastructure that's being supported by third parties like Microsoft. Very few people are actually hosting their own Exchange servers nowadays. You're going to do your mail through Microsoft or through Google. You're going to offboard that to someone who's spends all of their waking moments making that infrastructure as robust as possible. And so as a result, they tend to be more secure, they tend to be more stable, they tend to be overall cheaper. But it does mean that there's a lot more of our risk that is living in someone else's environment as opposed to just on our network. So a lot of the traditional tools that we use to make sure that our network is safe are not going to apply to that. And so making sure that we're on top of the tools that Microsoft or Google provide us to administer those cloud platforms and make sure that they are configured the way that we would want. Obviously, over the last few years, AI use has become a huge issue, one that was not foreseen when the original RC3 assessment was being written. So we have strong opinions that you want to have some sort of policy governing AI use on your network, because if you don't have a policy, that doesn't mean that people aren't going to use it. They're just going to be using it how they see fit. It's going to be the Wild West, and that can introduce a lot of data leakage issues where potentially people are putting information into that AI large language model that then gets stored and becomes part of the training data moving forward. And so potentially down the road, someone unrelated to your co-op asks a question about the co-op industry, and maybe as an example, it pulls out the data that one of your employees put into it the year before. And so we want to make sure that we've got some controls in place there so that we aren't accidentally putting information out into the world that we don't want. And in that same vein, data loss prevention. This is highly tied in with AI, but also email, different ways that we interact with the world. There's the possibility of information getting out that we don't want. There are technical systems available to check for that sort of information. That goes from things as simple as just looking for 9-digit numbers and blocking emails that have those, because that could be a social security number, and so we just want to put a stop to that. And the original ones were very simple, just looking for things that look like account numbers and things like that. But now AI can in turn power some of those data loss prevention products and figure out on a more kind of intelligent basis, is this information that's going out something that shouldn't be going out? Are we potentially giving away stuff that someone would be able to use in a future cyber attack? And then it can put a stop to it. Greg also mentioned that we are expanding to additional services beyond the assessment program. Thus far, RECAP has been based on once every 2 years going around to each co-op and doing an assessment. we've now shifted to 3 times a year coming out to do something. That could be the assessment. That could also be, for example, a tabletop exercise. So that is something where we get the IT department and some of the different stakeholders in the organization, some of the executive team, all in a room together and kind of game through what would happen if a cyber attack or a natural disaster, something like that, were to impact our co-op, and kind of talk through, what would that process look like? Who would we be bringing in? What resources do we have? And try to uncover as much as possible the blind spots in that process so that we can fix those, on a 10 a.m. on a Tuesday rather than Saturday morning at 3 a.m. when everything's breaking and people are on vacation and things like that. So while the weather's good, we want to be looking at the possibilities there and making sure that we're as ready as possible. We've got a few different exercises available so far. The 2 that we've been doing are focused on basically the major types of attacks that co-ops are facing nowadays. One being the supply chain, ransomware style attack. These are commercial hackers who are trying to make a buck, who are using ransomware in order to extract money from co-ops. The numbers involved for the ransom itself are often not that high. The really ornery thing about ransomware attacks is that the damage that they cause is so much larger than the actual ransom itself. It's kind of like steel and copper. Like it takes way more resources to fix it than you actually get for selling the copper itself. An example of this would be, a few years back, you may have heard about the Colonial Pipeline breach. I think the requested ransom there was something like $8 million, and the FBI even ended up tracking down about 70% of it. So the hackers got about $2-3 million out of it. But in terms of the broader national impact, in terms of shipping that didn't happen, rushes on the gas stations, things like that, it ended up being $2 or $3 billion. So you have like a 1,000x disparity there between what the hacker's actually getting and the cost to recover from it. So that's something that we very much want to keep an eye on. And so most of the co-ops have been through that exercise at this point. And then the other major category is these targeted nation-state attacks on on various utilities, particularly the electrical grid. So this would be like China trying to get in there and see if they can disrupt things and slow our economy down so that they can become more competitive relative to us on a global basis. And we'll be adding more of those in the future, but those are the ones that we've been doing so far. In addition to tabletop exercises, there's a number of different trainings that we make available to any of the co-ops, whether that's for the general staff, just kind of instructing them as to what the state of the industry is, what sort of attacks are out there, what role they play in helping prevent them, social engineering, how to use AI in safe and secure ways. We also offer trainings to the technical staff at your different co-ops, helping them through the process of making sure that the IT and the engineering side of things are properly separated, that they're not going to have attacks from the IT side flowing into something grid related, and what sort of architectures are more protective of that. I've also come out and done briefings for your boards or whatever you like. This is a list of things that I've done in the past, but if you have something particularly in mind that you'd like to have run at your co-op, give me the idea and I'll happily put something together for you. In addition to that, we've been trying to kind of on the off years when an assessment's not happening, go through and just go over the results from the last one, make sure that things are being addressed that were discovered, that if there are any sort of obstacles standing in the way of implementing some of the higher priority items there, that we can figure out strategies to get around those things and make sure that we're actually getting everything tightened down. And finally, going through and helping people develop or review their policies. So we've done a lot of development of new AI policies over the last couple of years, since that's been a fresh issue, but also developing those cyber incident response plans and making sure that those are ready for game day. But whatever sort of policies are lacking, we're happy to step in and help you develop those, provide templates to make that job a little more attainable. From here, we're not entirely sure what other categories we might add, we have had a little discussion of potentially doing some sort of risk assessment, which looks a little bit different from the assessments that we've been doing. That gets more into sort of quantifiable, here's the annual, dollarized risk from this sort of attack, that sort of attack, and steps that can be taken to reduce those numbers. That's going to be a little bit of a tough nut to crack because it requires a lot of insider knowledge to really flesh those out. But if we can provide something that goes in that direction, that would be helpful for you guys. We are interested in figuring out what we can provide on that side. So just as kind of an example of what the schedule would look like, if this is 1 year, one co-op might be doing an assessment early in the year, going on doing a policy review later on, and then scheduling a training in the fall. Whereas another co-op might decide, well, we did an assessment last year, so we're going to do a review this year. We're going to, bring Eric in to brief the board on what sort of threats exist, and then we're going to end the year with a tabletop exercise and see if we're ready for an incident. And so this is just, this is not me setting the schedule for you guys. This is whatever you'd like to see, whatever's a priority for your co-op. If you love tabletop exercises and want to schedule 2 of those a year, okay, I'll come out and do 2 of those a year. But whatever kind of works for you, what meets your felt needs, we're happy to provide that. In terms of kind of the broader state and national things that we've been doing through the RECAP program, the state of Ohio has asked us to be part of their Ohio Comprehensive Cyber Plan Planning Committee. And that's kind of establishing what the long-term direction of Ohio's cyber program is going to look like. How different organizations within the state respond to and manage cyber risks. So that's predominantly about government entities, so a lot of local and municipal governments. But it does get into critical infrastructure as well. So they want to have some representatives from the electric industry, from the water industry, and so that's just starting up this year. They had kind of a related but different program last year that we were a part of, but this is the vessel moving forward that is going to be kind of representing those different interests in the state of Ohio for strengthening cybersecurity. So they're bringing a lot of disparate voices there to make sure that all of the impacted entities are adequately covered and have a voice there. And I just want to make clear, they wanted to make clear that this is not going to result in some sort of regulation that is going to come down on the co-ops. This is very much about establishing best practices and some useful playbooks, things like that, that people can benefit from, that they can incorporate as they wish in order to make more cybersecurity resources available to Ohioans. Also, the NRECA has, for the last few years, had a program called Project Guardian, and there are a few different parts of that, but one of them is the Cyber Champions program, of which I'm a part. There are 12 cyber champions across the country, and their stated goal for this is to identify, replicate, and scale successful cybersecurity efforts and programs within cooperative utilities, focusing on cybersecurity awareness, services, guidance, and collaboration in a specific area or region. And they're big fans of what we're doing here in Ohio. They, at kind of the inaugural Cyber Champions meeting, they used Ohio as one of the 3 kind of test cases for what the Cyber Champions program nationally should look like, and we're seeing what lessons they could learn from what we've been doing here. They had me on at their Co-op Cybertech conference this summer for a discussion of what co-ops are doing in order to strategize about cyber defense. So that was a nice pat on the back from the NRECA that what we're doing here is valuable and something that they like to see replicated. And then just a few other services outside of my actual visits to different co-ops. There are cybersecurity office hours that I hold every month. So anybody in your IT departments can feel free to hop on those calls and ask any questions about cybersecurity that they'll like to. We can have a discussion amongst your peers. That can be very productive. I usually try to bring a few topics of my own, but the more questions you guys bring, of your own accord, I think the more relevant to the different co-ops that time can be. Additionally, I spend more time monitoring cyber threats than I think you'd probably want your IT departments doing, because obviously there's a lot involved in just making sure that the network is stable and that people are able to log into their email and all that. And so you don't want to spend half of a person's time looking at how threats are changing. I do take time to digest all that and inform the different co-ops of when there's something that's particularly noteworthy that you should take a look at, really nasty vulnerabilities that are coming out or industry trends, things like that. And also, we have had situations in the past where you don't necessarily have a large IT department at every co-op, and sometimes you lose a member of IT staff on short notice, and it can be very difficult to onboard a person when there's no overlap between the old employee and the new. If you have someone retiring, you can have a nice leisurely time where you have a few months of overlap and you onboard that person. But if someone gives their 2 weeks and now suddenly your IT department's gone, that could be very challenging to get someone up to speed on what's going on within the co-op world and the transitioning into that role. So I have been kind of putting together a playbook there for how to help get people up to speed as quickly as possible when we have those employees stepping into new roles around the state. And finally, I just wanted to talk about a few kind of rising or current threats. As mentioned, the kind of for-profit ransomware and nation-state attacks on the grid are sort of ever-present things, and things that we should very much be used to defending against. But stuff that is more of the moment, obviously Iran. We've gone back and forth a few times there on whether or not we're having a conflict or not. But throughout all of that process, we have seen them engaging in more and more cyber attacks. So traditionally, China is the major attacker against the grid, but whenever Iran gets riled up, they start punching as best they can, and so we see a lot more attacks coming out of them this year than we did previously. And they do like targeting critical infrastructure. That's their main thing. So we get to be the beneficiaries of that. Another thing to keep an eye on, you may have heard of Mythos. This is Anthropic's latest pre-release AI. It's incredibly impressive. And Anthropic's kind of selling point compared to other AIs all along has been that it's way more conscious of how code works. So it's really useful for someone who's doing software development to have Claude, alongside them, and be able to have it do a lot of the heavy lifting on, writing lines of code, and then they can tweak things and, be able to put stuff into production much more rapidly. Now, Mythos takes that a step further, and it's very conscious of cybersecurity, aspects of code. Detecting vulnerabilities, understanding how something would be exploited, and that's useful for security researchers being able to use that to make sure that their code is safe. It's also very scary from the perspective that if a hacker were to use that, they could send it loose on detecting all the vulnerabilities in pieces of published software and then build exploits for those vulnerabilities. So they've kind of recognized that threat and have not released it to the public yet, but they have made it available to 11 different major organizations, like the Mozilla Foundation, in order to check their software against Mythos and see what they can find. And Mozilla announced that within the first 2 weeks of using it, they had discovered 271 new vulnerabilities. And some of these are things that existed in their code going back over a decade. There are people finding vulnerabilities in very fundamental protocols used across the IT world that have been there undetected for 20 years. I'm not sure that I would say that Mythos is better than humans are at finding vulnerabilities, but it looks at vulnerabilities from a fundamentally different perspective. So the kinds of vulnerabilities that it finds look a little bit different from the kinds of vulnerabilities that humans find, which means there's a whole bunch of virgin soil there for it to till and find all sorts of things that humans are not very good at discovering. So it's currently blocked from publication, but I don't anticipate that will happen forever, and I don't anticipate that they'll be the only player around who's able to do this sort of thing in the long term. So that's something to kind of keep in the back of your mind, that as AI gets better and better, it's going to be able to be used for automated hacking. And in fact, there's a video of one of their researchers out there basically just telling it, go hack this thing, and it sets off to it, and it goes through 32 different steps in order to go from initial ingress all the way to the point that it has complete control over an entire network. It's very impressive, and it takes like a few minutes to do, because one thing AI does is do it fast. So I anticipate that there will be a lot of zero-day vulnerabilities, that is, vulnerabilities that don't have some sort of previously available patch coming in the next few years as AIs get better and we start to see more competitors with Anthropic catch up. And then a final category I wanted to make mention of, getting outside of cybersecurity a little bit, but we're seeing a lot of online threats being made toward different like physical field equipment, substations, things like that. A lot of this ties in with the overall animus against data centers, and people have made the point of like, well, why would we attack a data center which is consuming 100 megawatts of power when it's a giant concrete building with no windows, but the substation that's feeding it is chain link fence. We could just go over there and bust up the substation, and that's way easier than actually attacking the data center. So it falls to us then to actually make sure that those assets are secure. I included a comment here that EISAC found on an online forum where a person was making the point, like, yeah, don't attack the data centers, just fly drones, trailing, conductive tape over the substations and, break them that way. So are we going to respond to that by putting all of our substations in concrete bunkers? Probably not. But we do want to have some thought toward making sure that we have sufficient monitoring out there, that we do have cameras on site, because this is probably going to become an issue, and it's very hard to say when. The nature of attacks like this is that they kind of enter the public consciousness and catch fire at unpredictable times. And as a kind of comparison case to consider, I would appeal to what we've seen happen with school shootings like over the past few decades. There's no technology that was introduced that made a school shooting possible. We've always had schools, we've always had guns. You could have done it 100 years ago. And in fact, the first examples of this happened about 70 years ago. And they really entered the public consciousness in the 90s with Columbine. But there still weren't that many for a long time. And then suddenly, in 2019, the amount of school shootings tripled over the course of the next few years. Why 2019? We don't really know. But that's when it caught fire. And so in the same sort of way, I have no way of saying when attacks on physical infrastructure are going to spike, but I bet they will. And I would much rather have prepared for them ahead of time when we get to that moment. That's what I got. I don't know if you have any questions for either of us. Cool.